Good morning. It is Palm Sunday, and I hope that you got a chance to get your palm. I hope that you will wave your palm as you come through the building today, as you head over to the pancake breakfast, because the palms really are a wonderful symbol. And it's a symbol that we understand metaphysically, that we understand that beyond the physical definition of an actual palm frond, that for us today, it represents strength. It represents a spiritual strength. So in the story you've already heard this morning, we have Jesus who comes into Jerusalem, and he's riding on the back of a donkey. And it's very significant historically why it was a donkey and not a horse. Because I began looking at that and going, who would take that seriously if he came riding in on a donkey? That's kind of like having the president show up in a Metro or one of those little Volkswagen Rabbits. But you see, Jesus was very intentional because historically, if you come in on a donkey, it symbolizes that you're coming in from a place of peace. If you'd ridden a horse, the message would have been, I've come here to rule. And so as it is our first day of Holy Week, the end of Lent, the end of a time of preparation, we notice that within this story, there are elements that even today we can still apply to our life, to our heart. Have we had one of those experiences where one day around an event in our life, let's say like a wedding, we are celebrating and it's exciting and things are new and fresh and people are shouting for us. Then you come home, maybe after the honeymoon, maybe after a year later, and you realize, celebrating was not all that encompasses this experience. For Jesus came in celebrating because it was a fulfillment of the Jewish law. So this man named Jesus, who's been preaching and teaching what we think for probably 3 years, comes in and he's greeted in two ways. One is by those palms of strength. Perhaps he knew what lay at the end of the week for him, perhaps not. But he comes into the palms of strength. And then there were those who did not have palms, and they took off their coat or their cloak, and they laid it down. Now, in our culture, that's not something we're familiar with at all. But in that culture, it was a sign of deep reverence and respect. And so he's greeted with strength and reverence. Has there been a time in our life when we've needed to become aware of that strength within us, that power and presence that is within us? Last week we had a wonderful experience. Many of you have told me that you really enjoyed our Sunday service of Ask the Ministers, where my husband, Ogun Holder, was also here with me, and we took questions, theological questions, and one of them was about Jesus. And the question really became clearer to me this week as I was working with It's Holy Week. We do it a little differently at Unity, right? And it occurred to me, part of the experience of Holy Week is to know that each day we open anew. Each week we open anew. That's why we come together in spiritual community on Sunday, to renew, to recharge, and go back out into the world. So this week, I wonder, are you willing to notice how the energies change and to do it without judgment? That's always my favorite homework task for us, to do it without judgment, to know that there is within us a divine potential, because we teach that, we talk about it all the time. And yet at Easter time, it is an even more in-depth commitment. And it's a commitment to divine potential. Because that's what Jesus symbolizes for us in unity. It's divine potential expressed. So each of us have that same divine potential, and we have something called free will. Will we exercise our free will and say, I open up to an even deeper understanding of my divine nature? For you see, when Jesus rode in on the back of a donkey, he was going to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, metaphysically, represents a habitation of peace. Because I can look at each and every one of you and say, you are the Christ. And yet, unless you come to a place of awareness, centeredness, humility, and faith, our little personality that says, this is who I am, don't mess with me, here are my boundaries, is always going to come up. It's always going to make itself known. And it's that free will moment where we remember, no, my divine nature says that I can live this kind of life. A life of celebration, but also a life of surrender. Because we continue with the story, and we find that Jesus later in the week had quite a surrender. And it was in the garden. In the Garden of Gethsemane, with his closest friends. Do you remember the story? He asked them to stay awake while he went over, maybe over a little hill, to pray. And when he came back, what happened? They were asleep. That's my challenge to you this week. Don't go to sleep to your divine nature. Notice and take a deep breath before you open your mouth in a reactive way. Ooh, all right, she's pointing now, fingers. I'll point at myself. Open, take a breath, take a moment before we react from a place of, I'm justified. And ask, what would peace, what would the Jerusalem of my soul have me know and do and be right now? Many of you know that I was on vacation, a long postponed vacation 2 weeks ago. And I had the privilege of being in the presence of a man whose name is Michael. I've known Michael on and off because this is where my husband's from, Barbados. And so when we go there to that country, we have a couple things that are our tradition to do. And Michael's an entrepreneur and a business owner, and he owns a little itty-bitty cafe. I use that word lightly. The walls open up, and there's some tables and chairs. But it's right on the beach. And so he's one of the few private businessmen on the island, and we really enjoy giving our money to local folks. And something was different about Michael this time. He also is the guy we always rent our kayaks or our chairs and umbrella. Something was different about him this year. We told him we wanted to go snorkeling, and typically he just arranges it with one of the businessmen that he works with, but he said, I'll take you. I thought, wow, that's very interesting. I really have always liked him. And he didn't say anything. He was Mr. Tour Guide, a real block while we were on the boat. Everyone was snorkeling, swimming with a turtle or something. I didn't swim with turtles. They're half my body size, and I just think that's gross to swim with them. They're like throwing pieces of fish at them. I'm like, that's too close. So I stayed. I stayed on the boat for that piece of the adventure. And I just said to Michael, I said, you don't typically take us out. What's going on? Or do you not have a scuba excursion plan this afternoon? He said, I don't do that anymore. I said, really? That's your business. He said, yeah, I've hired other people to do that for me. I said, why don't you scuba anymore, Michael? He said, I don't have it in me. I don't have the love for it in me. And I said, well, what do you have the love for? He said, I am here on planet Earth to contribute. I was like, tell me a little bit more. He said, there's nothing more to tell. I'm here on planet Earth to contribute. He was so in touch. And part of that had been there'd been a death in his family, and he'd begun to reevaluate life, and he's also the guardian of his special needs brother. And he said, I'm just here to contribute. I don't do anything I don't want to do. I heard that. I don't do anything I don't want to do. I said, yeah, but there's the whole business piece. He said, I decide that I want to do it. I don't just begrudgingly go through it. And I said, sounds like you had quite the crossing out experience. He said, yes. And then he opened up and he began to speak a little bit more about his life and about his mom and about his business. And I just couldn't help but look at this man that I've only seen every 2 years for the last 15 years and noticed a progression of openness. And maybe he's just stepped into his divine nature just a little more. This morning, that's what we invite you to do. We affirm together that there is the Jerusalem of our heart, that place of peace. And that as we walk through this week, this afternoon, or tomorrow, that we have a choice point to choose to be in that place of peace, to welcome it like the cloaks, and to know that the palms are within us and all around us, strengthening us. Namaste.